We can spill something, hopefully not. Yeah, thanks for having me. Everybody, thanks for coming as well. It's a pleasure to be here. Also not alone, I'm here together with my partner and colleague Jessica. And yeah, I was asked to share some information and knowledge about the work that we do at the Black Archives, which is not too far from here, but you do have to cross a border. Um, and yeah, so what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna tell a little bit about the history of the Black Archives, how it came about, why it came about, and I'll try to highlight and amplify some of the exhibitions and art projects that we have developed over the past years. Um, and I can talk a lot, but if there are some questions in between or if there are some things which are not clear, feel free to raise your hand, ask a question, or maybe even contribute something. We believe in sharing knowledge and not just dumping knowledge. So, all right, let's go. So let's start by introducing myself. This is a picture of me, my class in first year of secondary school. So in the Netherlands, you go to school. I was born and bred in the Netherlands. My parents are from Suriname. Is everybody familiar with Suriname? Yeah. Anybody who does not know where Suriname is? No? All right. Good, very good. Everybody paid attention to geography. That's nice. Former Dutch colony in South America, for those who may be a bit shy to say they didn't know. And I actually just came back from Suriname. It was Monday, I flew back. It was 32 degrees there, so I'm still a bit warming up. But my parents are from there. As many other Surinamese people from the former colony they came in the 1970s. So I'm the first generation born and bred here in the Netherlands, in Europe. And I come from quite a big family. My grandmother had 50 children. Grandpa had 16, so one extra in between. All those children had a lot of children as well. And the reason I'm saying that is because more than 50 cousins, very tight family. But I was the first in my branch to go to university, academic education. In the Dutch system, you go to primary school. At the end of primary school, you make a test. Based on the test, you get advice to go to a certain level of secondary education. So, on quite a young age, when you're 11, 12, you're already like tracked into a certain level. And so, pre-academic, college, or vocational. So, I went to the pre-academic, and this was my class when I was about 12. As you can see, you can try to guess where I'm standing. So, 50-50 odds. The little boy with the white sweater, that's me. Few years later, I was still there, and I think it's a bit easier to spot me. Why? Because I was the only black boy in class. That's why I'm showing this. So I went to a lyceum, Spinoza Lyceum, which means you have all levels of education on one school. But what I noticed was that on school there was a lot of diversity, kids from all kinds of backgrounds, Turkish, Moroccan, white, Dutch, French, German. I don't know if they were Belgians, but all kinds of people. However, in my class, or pre-academic, I was often the only black boy. And I don't have a problem with anybody. I can get along with all people if you're not extreme right and racist. But I just started to notice that. Another thing I noticed was that we had to learn a lot about, history, and culture, the Enlightenment, and the Second World War, Greeks and the Romans, all kinds of parts of history. However, we did not learn that much about colonial history, and the history about slavery, the history about the place where my parents are from, Suriname, which is also part of Dutch history because they had been the colonial powers over there for more than 300 years. And I did learn about it from home, so I already noticed at a young age, like, hey, the history books don't tell all of the stories that I find interesting. Is that something that some of you recognize, that you went to school and didn't learn much, for example, about colonial history? Who can identify with that? Yeah, quite some people. So it's not just a Dutch thing. You see it all over the world, that often certain parts of history are underexposed. So I continued, went to university, a few universities in Amsterdam, started with business administration because I thought, hey, I'm the first in my family, let me do something so I can make some money. However, after a while I was like, hey, there's more than profit maximization and marketing and money in the world. So let's look at some other things. Another thing was that going to university again, just like secondary school, there was not that much diversity, both in the student body, but also in the curriculum, what we had to learn. So with a few friends, I set up the New Urban Collective. It was a collective, a student platform for black students of color who wanted to, learn more about certain parts of history and culture. And not just the history, but also the present, about personal development. We organized all kinds of things, lectures, debates, workshops, youth exchanges, and it attracted all kinds of people, not just students, but a lot of people were hungry for this knowledge. And this was around 2011 that we started. Went quite well, we did our thing. And after a few years, we were approached by a few guys named Jemo and Miguel Halber. On this picture, upper left, you can see them in the corner. On the right upper corner, you can see a picture of their father. Their father was Waldo Halber. And Waldo was a sociologist, came from Suriname, ended up working at the University of Amsterdam, and he did a lot of research on colonial history and history of slavery. But not just about the history itself, but also how this history is often being presented and shared. So, in one of the books, for example, Op zoek naar de stilte, looking for the silence, they looked at Dutch cultural institutions and to which extent they deal with this part of history. And the title kind of reflects the conclusion, it was relatively silent. In another booklet, The Future of the Past, he looked at, okay, how do we deal with this history? And I know it's a long quote, I'm not supposed to put so much text on one slide, but I couldn't help myself. But what he basically said is that, history is often presented as if there's one objective and neutral history. It's the history because it's like this in the school books, it's the history because it's like this in the museum. However, he argued, and a lot of critical post-colonial or decolonial scholars agree, is that history is not some neutral phenomenon. In fact, you can see it as a reconstruction of the past, in which choices are made about which stories we tell, which ones we don't, which perspective we take in conflicts, who we see as national heroes, who we see as the villains, who or what is even allowed to be addressed. Sometimes certain things are, still taboo subjects. So what he argued is that, power plays an important role in the construction of history, and that then fuels how we look at ourselves, our collective identity, who's part of the nation, who's not part of the nation, us and them. And often these dominant historical narratives are, constructed by the dominant groups of classes in society. And in the Dutch case, that often means that certain parts of history, as I said, such as slavery, such as colonial history, are a bit marginalized. And we have seen some change over the past years, I have to admit. But you still see that certain parts are underexposed. Can you still follow what I'm saying? Yeah? Okay. Now we're going a little step further. Because another scholar, Michel Trio, anthropologist, he takes the same approach, but he goes one step further. Because often, when people look critically at historical narratives. They indeed focus on the narrative, so the story that is being told. However, where do you go for sources to tell your story? Yeah, assume that some of you maybe study here or have studied something. And usually, when you maybe have to write something or you have to produce something, and you make a historical claim, and you need to come with sources. And if you just make something up, yeah, the teacher will say like, hey, this is not good. You will probably not get a pass. So where do people go for sources? Yeah, the library, maybe. Hey, go to other books, maybe an academic article. But when you want to look at primary sources, as historians do, you usually go to the archives, a national archive, a city archive, maybe a cultural archive, to find the primary sources, like the raw material. However, what Trujillo argues is that even in the archives, you see that there's already an inequality. And he uses the case of the Haitian Revolution, the revolution in Haiti, what we now know as Haiti. So, everybody familiar with the Haitian Revolution? No. I'm gonna throw in some quiz questions every now and then. Yeah, so one of the few, maybe only you could say, successful slave revolt in the Caribbean, where they overthrew the French imperial power and set up their own republic. And he wanted to do the research about this. So he went to the archives in both Haiti, but also in France, in Paris. And what he found was that it was very hard, almost impossible to find the perspectives of the, people who rose up against slavery. Yeah? So Toussaint Louverture, one of the leaders, was almost impossible to find documents with his thoughts, with his words. However, if you wanted to know the perspective of the French plantation owners and parliament, there were tons of minutes and notes and archival documents. Why? Because in that context of colonialism, slavery, the enslaved people were not even seen as people, they were seen as production tools. So why would you document their thoughts? It was even forbidden for them to read and write. So they did not leave behind books and reflections and things like that. So what he argues is that already in that, what he calls moment of fact creation, so when things are written and we think it's important enough to save it, to document it, there's already an inequality there, especially in the context of colonial history. Does it make sense what I'm saying? Yeah, okay. Let's look at another concrete case of the Netherlands. This is something that we did research on ourselves. This year, they call it the commemoration year in the Netherlands. Little quiz question: does anybody know which year slavery was abolished in the Dutch context? You can also guess.
I'll guess, I think somewhere in the 70s.
19 or 18?
I was thinking 90.
Slavery, yeah?
Yeah, 90s,
Okay.
70s.
Possibly. Let me hear one or two more. It's okay. We're here to learn. We're here to learn. So in the Dutch context, slavery was abolished in 1863/73. But Suriname gained independence in 1975. So if you talk about independence, you're right, but slavery a bit earlier. So the Dutch abolished in 1833. The English 1834. The French 1848. The Dutch were one of the last. And we're talking about slavery, not colonialism. So this document, we have an original one in our archive. I may have a scan of it in the PowerPoint, but we have an original one, and it's called a wisselbrief, or promissory note. Yeah, so it was a bill that was given or produced during the abolishment of slavery. And this is a not too high quality picture I took in the Rijksmuseum, so the National Museum of History in the Netherlands, Museum Square, Amsterdam. And they have this little corner dealing with the, former colonies. And there you see this whistle brief. And what is the whistle brief? So slavery is abolished 1863. Dutch were one of the last. Why were they one of the last? Because a lot of the plantation owners were not necessarily, say that, in favor of abolishment. And if it had to be abolished, on their terms. So they argued that if the state was to abolish slavery, that would mean they would lose their production tools, their free labor. Hence, they argued that's unfair, quote unquote. So they should have a form of compensation because, those poor slave or plantation owners, what would they do with that are enslaved? So there's a long debate about it. And when you go to the National Archive, you can see all the minutes, the letters, the petitions of these plantation owners. And they finally came to the conclusion, like, indeed, we will abolish slavery, however, under 3 conditions. So one of the conditions was indeed, they would get compensation. In Suriname, they got 300 guilders per enslaved person. It would be about 3,000 euros. So on a bill like this, each plantation owner got a bill, and they had to make a registry. How many enslaved people do I have on my plantation? Some at 10, some at 100, some at 300. And then they will get 300 per person. Second condition was that they argued that it would probably become one big chaos because, these people had to be forced to work because they are not, civilized as us. So we have to force them, and they're not ready for freedom yet. So let's give them 10 more years to, get civilized and get used to their freedom. Hence, a lot of people argued it was not actually 1863, but 1873, which is 150 years ago this year. Third condition, related to the other tools, that they said, they will probably flee the plantations. So the whole system will crumble if we don't have other workers. So we need other workers. So what did they do? They recruited people in other colonies like Indonesia, Java, in India, some people in China to work on the plantations as so-called contract workers or indentured laborers. And although they did not live in slavery and quote unquote kind of signed a contract, they were also being exploited and had to face very harsh circumstances. So we go to the Rijksmuseum, and all you see is whistle brief, slavery was abolished, 1863, the plantation owners got compensation. That's it. However, when you look at the archives, as I said, it's very hard to find the other perspective. Because when we're talking about the abolishment of slavery, maybe it would be interesting to learn or know what enslaved people thought about it. What they imagined about freedom and society and culture. But that's very hard to find because, again, they were not seen as human enough. So, there are ways to, read between the lines, to still find some perspectives from the enslaved. And funny enough, the most, I won't say reliable, but one of the sources where you could find perspectives of enslaved people are those from the courts and the police files from colonialism. Why? Because generally they would not record things from enslaved people. However, when they rose up, when they revolted, when they maybe took revenge or tried to run away and were caught, they had to be prosecuted. They had to face court, and that was, of course, well documented. So when you look at those files, you'll see bits and pieces, sometimes even longer stories of the enslaved. And coincidentally, again, this one, this wisselbrief promissory note was given to Willem van Utrecht. Willem van Utrecht, or the family van Utrecht, was owner of the plantation Knip on the plantation Curaçao. Sorry, on the island Curaçao, the plantation Knip. I hope you're familiar with Curaçao. It's one of the islands that the Dutch colonized. And that, coincidentally, was one of the biggest, or the place where one of the biggest slave revolts happened in the Caribbean, especially in the Dutch context in 1795. Because they heard about the Haitian Revolution, which started around that time, and they fought for years. They heard that the rumor was that the enslaved of Haiti would free themselves and would come to the other islands to help them rise up as well. So a big revolt started on Plantation Knip, led by a person named Tula. Unfortunately, after a few weeks of fighting, they did lose the battle. But, you know, it's a very important mark in history, in Dutch history, European history, Caribbean history, which is not taught in school. And why am I showing this? Because, again, as I said, with one document, you can tell multiple stories. You can tell the story of abolishment, slavery, and the plantation always got money. That's what you see in the Rijksmuseum. But what we also say is that if you tell that story, also tell the story of resistance, that these people are not just passive, complacent beings accepting their position as slaves. No, they did try to free themselves and rose up. So this was the story for a few years, and there was a lot of debate about it. I think a positive development is that even the Rijksmuseum came to some new insights, and 2 years ago, I think, they developed a big exhibition about the history of slavery, which included the story of Tula, which is a good thing. They still have a lot of work to do, but it's a step forward, I would say. Any questions in between? Everything clear? Yeah. I'll take a sip of tea quickly. All right. So, I mentioned Mr. Halbrand. Yeah, so we did a lot of research, published a lot, also active outside of academia, did a lot of things in the community. But unfortunately, he passed away due to sickness. And when he passed away, he left behind quite a large collection of books related to his work. So a lot about colonialism, anti-colonialism, gender, social science, those kind of things. So a lot of books which were not necessarily that accessible and hard to find. So his sons inherited that collection, about 2,000 to 3,000 books and some documents, and had it at home for quite a long time. And after a while, they were like, hey, let's do something. Our father would have wanted more. Let's try to make it more available to the public. And they approached a lot of institutions, a lot of MISIA and Archives, but none of them were really interested. And then they approached us, and we were interested, but we didn't have money, or at least not that much, nor space. But we did get the opportunity to use a little room in Amsterdam North to, experiment. So, bought some cheap shelves at IKEA, put the books in there. We called it our library, the NUC Cafe, New Urban Cafe, where people could hang out and check out the Halbrand collection. And that went well, but after a few months we had to leave because of gentrification. So when we were looking for a different space, we ended up in the building where we are based now. And that is in Amsterdam East. So this is the building of the Association of Surinamese People. And so all this association of people of Surinamese descent in the Netherlands founded in 1919. And we heard about them, heard they had some space, so we came to check it out. So when we got there, early 2016, this is what the space looked like on top. And as you can see, it was not really, well organized, you could say. A bit dusty, a bit, beetje rommelig, we would say in Dutch. So We were desperate for space, not much money. Amsterdam is very expensive for space to live, let alone for a bunch of books. So we made a deal with them where we said, hey, we can help you clean up if we can put our books there as well. Yeah, win-win situation. So when we started cleaning up, that's when we found out that there was a lot of fascinating material, almost like a hidden history and schatkamers and a treasure that we found. I'll show a few examples, even brought a few things. But here you can see, for example, on the left, very nice ebony magazine, Martin Luther King on the cover. In the middle, Time magazine, well-known author James Baldwin. On the right, one of the first editions of Malcolm X autobiography. And if you look closely, you see something sticking out, so it also contained newspaper clippings from that time. In the middle, one of the biggest gems, a book signed by a author named Langston Hughes. Anybody familiar with Langston Hughes? No? Oh yeah? Yeah, what did you hear about Langston Hughes?
Wasn't he also a poet? But I'm not sure.
Indeed.
Writer as well, but besides that.
Yeah. Indeed, he was a poet, writer, part of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1930s when there was a big cultural movement among African Americans, Black Americans in Harlem, New York, especially, but also broader in the US. He was one of the, well-known writers writing about, the experience of Black people in that period. So we found several books of him with his autographs and notes. So we were like, whoa, this is really, it's like you find a book or a CD, signed by Beyonce, Burna Boy. He was well known back in the days. So we knew that this was something special. But also things from closer to home. So a few examples. This one, so pamphlet saying apartheid. So we thought, it's about South Africa. Then we started to look into it and saw like, it's not about South Africa, it's about the Netherlands. That when people came in the 1970s to Amsterdam, Rotterdam, they were not welcome in certain areas because they said, hey, we don't want too many Black people in certain neighborhoods. And newspapers where we saw or read and learned about the squatting movement in Amsterdam Southeast, the Bijlmer, and that's now known as a very multicultural neighborhood, a Black neighborhood. But yeah, because of this, we learned that was not a coincidence, but because people claimed their space by squatting empty buildings when they were not welcome in other places of the city. Pictures of people marching for the independence of Suriname. One of my favorite pictures, visual artist Admat Bach, musical artist Zapataya, another musical artist Ronald Snijders, and on the right, a lady named Judith de Kom. In the back you see the big Black Panther, and we were like, oh, Black Panther? Automatically thinking about the Black Panther Party in the US, but the picture was taken in Amsterdam in 1971. So we found out that apparently Surinamese artists and activists felt inspired by the Black Panther Party of the US, adopted the symbol and some of the anti-imperial thinking, and made it their own with the focus on independence and anti-imperialism in Suriname and the Dutch Caribbean. So, are you familiar with the story of Anton de Kom? Anybody? No, okay, no. Share the short version. Because in the middle, you see this picture with this guy. His name was Anton de Kom. I'll share the short version of the story. So he's born in Suriname, first generation after slavery, 1898. And, got the opportunity to go to school, did his thing. But as I said, slavery was abolished, but colonialism wasn't. So there was still a lot of exploitation, poverty, and misery. That's literally one of the titles of the articles that he wrote. Starvation, poverty, and misery in Suriname. So he did go to the Netherlands first, via Haiti and a few other places to look for better opportunities. And in the Netherlands, he came in touch with communists and Indonesian nationalists, which inspired him to think more critically about the situation back home in Suriname. So after a few years, he had a family and children, went back to Suriname to see how he could, help the suffering and exploited people. However, because he was in touch with communists and nationalists, he was already being, watched by the police and surveillance organizations. So he was not allowed to give speeches like now. He was not allowed to engage in political activities. So came with a clever idea to set up a advisory board or company on the yard of his mom. I mean, who can be against that? But became so popular because all those workers who were being exploited came to him for legal advice and social advice. So he became a threat to the colonial order. So they arrested him. One day it became so, became out of hand because he was so popular. People were fighting for his freedom. And police shot at the masses, killed a few people. And they quickly deported him to the Netherlands. And what makes his story extra special is that you could think that he had been deported from his own country, arrested, disrespected, that he thought like, hey, skip all these Europeans and white Dutch people. They took me from my own land, exploiting people. But even when the Second World War broke out and the Dutch were occupied by the Nazis, he did decide to join the resistance against them. And unfortunately, right before the end of the war, he was captured and sent to one of the concentration camps in Neuengamme, Germany. So, fascinating story. And in the meanwhile, he wrote a book called We Slaves of Suriname. It was the first book, you could say, with a critical anti-colonial perspective of a Surinamese person, written in 1934. So here you see a few editions. First edition, one from the 70s, and this one was launched in 2020, and we were also part of the relaunch. And what we found out via the archives was that his book was, because he was seen as too militant, too radical, it was quite hard to find the book. And via the archives, we found it already in the 1980s. Oh, I think I need to use my charger. In the 1980s, 1988 to be exact, activists set up a petition to honor Anton de Kom. So they made a petition, handed it in at the Dutch parliament, but never even got a reaction. Until 2020, when there were these big Black Lives Matter protests and all people were like, hey, we should educate ourselves and pay more attention to history. So more than 80 years after the original publication date, it became a bestseller. Interesting. So, a lot of more. So this is from the 1960s, people marching around the abolishment of slavery. This is what the archive looks like now. So you could say, yeah, we made some progress. And yeah, every day, every week, we still find interesting material. So I'm gonna show two examples of how we try to make hidden histories more visible in collaboration with artists. Because I see that to watch the time a little bit, but okay, shortly. So one of the books and perspectives that are important for us is the book of Gloria Wekker, anthropologist, Surinamese descent from the Netherlands, wrote this book in which she says, she uses the concept white innocence, saying that on the one hand, you have this very strong self-image, which is also actively projected to the rest of the world of the Netherlands, like, a country of openness, tolerance, freedom of speech, etc., etc., liberal laws around sex work, same-sex marriage, etc., etc. However, at the same time, the Dutch have been one of the large colonial and imperial nations for hundreds of years, and not just a few years, but more than 300 years. So it would make sense that 300 years of imperialism and colonial thinking, political and economic development left behind some traces in present day society, right? However, that legacy is often, disavowed, denied, often very emotionally. So this paradox she calls white innocence. And she uses a concept of this Palestinian anthropologist, Edward Said. He wrote Orientalism, then he writes about the idea of the cultural archive. So not a physical archive like we have, but the cultural archive where he says where ideas of 100 years of colonialism became part of how we think, how we behave, our unconscious way of thinking and dealing with each other. The same could be argued for the Dutch. So, I think I'm gonna shortly do this one and then document and everything. So, what we try to do and what we argue is that you have the cultural archive, you have the dominant archive, you could say, with the state archives, which naturally has the perspective of the Dutch state and its allies, such as plantation owners. And we have an archive, you could say, of oppressed people, formerly colonized people, which shows a different narrative, which counters the dominant narrative. And let's take this example of how we found the hidden history and try to share that through art. Story of Hermie and Otto Hassel. Has anybody heard of them before? No? Okay. Well, that's good because then you learn something new. Short version again. Otto, born in 1893, Suriname. Hermie, born in British Guyana, which is next to Suriname, in 1905. Just like Anton de Kom, first generation after slavery, go to school, do their thing. But in contrast to Anton, Otto, says, hey, I want to see more of the world. He becomes a sailor at a young age, 16 years old. Hops on a ship, destined to go to Amsterdam from Suriname, but he ends up in New York. Why? Stories that the captain was a drunk, he was just, doing crazy stuff. And Otto was not having it, so hopped off the ship. Back then, that was possible. Ends up in New York, finds a place to stay, a job, and to make a very long story short, he found Hermie. Both of them were active in, the cultural and political scene, and he became the only black co-founder of the Communist Party. So here you see him in Moscow, 1922. You could think like, hey, what the hell do these people have to do in Moscow in 1922, 101 years ago? That is because back then, most of the world was colonized, from Asia to Africa to South America. That was the status quo. And in theory, I'm talking rhetorically, in practice it was sometimes a bit different, but right after this Russian Revolution, Communist Revolution, there was a lot of talk about world revolution, anti-imperial revolution. So for a lot of people in the colonies who still, were being faced with colonial and imperial inequality, this sounded interesting. So people like Otto, on the right you see Claude McKay, a Jamaican poet and activist. They were like, hey, if you truly want a world revolution, you need to pay attention to one of the most exploited people in the world, which are black people. And they call this the Negro question. So they went there to argue and plead their case. Here you see a whole group of African American and Caribbean people in somewhere in the Soviet Union, 1930s, in the middle. Here you see Langston Hughes with these things on his white shirt. Otto, second from the right. sitting down. Traveled a lot. We're talking about the 1920s, 30s. So from Suriname to the US, Trinidad, Jamaica, but also Europe, Brussels, Berlin, a lot of places, even South Africa. There should be a star there as well. And I'm gonna skip this because of time. Maybe tomorrow during the session we can talk about that. But as I said, they were part of this international network of anti-imperial activists. One of the papers they published was The Negro Worker. One of the things we still have to do research on is that it was semi-illegal because they were fighting for a revolution. Colonial powers were not really into that, obviously. So they often had to hide what they did, and they were caught a few times, even in Brussels. So the stories that they got caught in Brussels, I believe 1933-ish, around that time. And there are still files in the National Archives of Brussels, but still need to get and ask for permission to look at the files, and that's something we still need to do. But yeah, did a lot of research on them because how did we find out about them? Yeah, remember you saw the book of Langston Hughes? Often they were directed to a lady named Hermie. So, dear Hermie, dear Hermie. So we were like, hey, who's Hermie? Then we found out that Hermie was short for Helmina Hazard. She came from British Guyana with her family. She moved to New York, like a lot of Caribbean people. Met Otto, and they became active together in this movement.
And married.
And married, absolutely. So here you see the FBI file about them. Both Otto and Hermie, such a thick file filled with surveillance reports in the 1930s. So when he went to Suriname, because of health reasons during the war, he was arrested immediately, locked up for a year and a half, and then placed under house arrest. And only after the war he was freed. So after the war, both Otto and Hermie decided to go to Amsterdam and became part of this association of Surinamese people. So I said it was set up in 1919, but it was it had been active for a while, but only after the war it really became anti-colonial, partly because people like Otto and Hermie came with their international experience, but also young people, young students who became very active and aware during the war. So what you saw was that there was this cultural movement, so people starting to write in their own language, Sani, making art, and we're part of an international movement as well. We went to a lot of international congresses, also in Belgium, France, Algeria. So they really saw themselves as part of this worldwide anti-colonial movement. And we found it such a fascinating story because even in the Netherlands, even in Suriname, a lot of people have never heard about this story. Why? Because for a long time it was just, repressed. To be black and communist and revolutionary, that was just, too much. So when you go to the archives, the most information about them you'll see in files under extremism, radical, anti-colonial. However, what we found in the archive of the association was their collection of books and documents. And part of it they left behind in New York, NYU, New York University. And we've done quite some research over the past years. We've been to Jamaica, Trinidad, and everywhere you see little and sometimes even larger traces of their work. So it's an ongoing research project for us. And we have a background in anthropology, so we do mostly historical research. But we are also very aware of the fact that not everybody has the time or capacity to delve into archives and do research. So the question was, how can we make it accessible for a broad group of people? Because it's not just about historical issues. To us, it's also about present day issues. A lot of the things they write and think about, wrote about then, are still very relevant now. So we decided to make an exhibition, but we were not curators, we were not exhibition makers or artists, but we did have a network of creative people and people with experience. So 2017, we came up with this idea and set up our first exhibition in the building of the Association of Surinamese People. And yeah, these are a few pictures of it. It was called Black and Revolutionary, the story of Hermie and Otto Haswat. And yeah, as some artists to make new work based on our research. On the one hand, the design was made by Raoul Balai. You see some work of KASKlezing, and she connected their story to the story of present-day activists fighting against the blackface tradition. So the Piet, we have heard about that in the Netherlands. Belgium has its own version as well. And what's nice is that since we started, it really started to travel and almost became got a life of its own. Yeah, so here we see a picture of an installation of KASKlezing. It's the same artist who made these drawings. And indeed, that's Jessica on the left. But she also made a beautiful painting of Edmina Haswat, in which she, kind of creatively connected her with other black women with the idea that often in history you see that certain histories are erased, black histories, women's histories as well. So there's this double erasure when it comes to black women. And she wanted to give them a podium, a stage at the Venice Biennale a few years ago. So yeah, again, work of her and Audre Lorde. So we try to be very aware of, these different layers of society and oppression, that people can face oppression based not just on race, but also gender, nationality, sexuality, religion, all those things. I use the term intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw. In the State Museum Amsterdam, we were invited to participate in a curatorial team. Also there we were able to contribute, a historical perspective. Usually, often, you just focus on the artistic layer of work, but we were able to also, contribute the social and even political historical context to some of the works. These are works of Nola Hattelman, who's a white lady who was active in the association and connected to Otto and Hermie. This is work of Adman Bach. And remember the picture of the 4 people on stage with the Black Panther? He was one of them. One of my favorite artists, but never was bought or even looked at by the major cultural art institutions until I would say a few years ago. So it was also a way to honor a lot of the artists who are often overlooked and underexposed. Same, this is work by René Tosani. He's still alive. We met him a few years ago in his work.
2 weeks ago.
Yeah, 2 weeks ago. It's Anton de Kom, also indigenous fighters, Maroons, so the people who fought against slavery. And these are just a few examples. I'm gonna skip a few things because of time, but we can go into that tomorrow. So last thing I'll look at is that last year, we were invited to also participate in Documenta 15. I believe the last lecture was of Taring Padi, also one of the collectives who are part of the Lumbung, invited by Rua Grupa. And to us, it was a beautiful opportunity to, look at our work and also learn from other collectives worldwide, and also look at the connections between our collection, our work, our archive, and those of others. So what we tried to do, or did, was that we looked at how, what are the connections of our work, our collection, our archive with the work of the other collectives. And what was beautiful was that in a lot of the work or research that we had already done on the Haswats, on Anton de Kom, I didn't really go into the anti-Black Pete movement today, can do that tomorrow. But you see that they've been interwoven with other movements. They've been in solidarity with other movements, in touch, in connection, uh, all the time, for decades. So that's how we came up with the idea to call it Interwoven Histories of Solidarity. And selected some art or archival material from our own collection, and also looked for connections at other archives. And yeah, you may have heard last year or last lecture that it was quite an experience, because for us, it was the first time to be part of such, international art manifestation. I'm gonna be honest, I was not even that familiar with Documenta. We come from a whole different scene, but we know that the status it has within the art world. Yeah, but the idea of sharing resources, sharing thoughts, and really collectively thinking about the stories that you want to tell, how to manage the budgets and the resources. It's a very inspiring and interesting way of working and practice, which we also try to practice a bit today. And it allowed us to experiment with ways of curating and presenting. So again, didn't go into it too deep today, but one of the projects that we have currently is about racist imagery, the history of colonial imagery. And yeah, Documenta allowed us to experiment with, how to present these things. Even the space where we are in now, Mohammed just told us where we came in. Yeah, this used to be a hospital. So this was probably one of the places where they dissected people as part of, medical studies. And then one of the things that we've studied of the past year in relation to the blackface tradition is how racial ideas about race, were produced and reproduced in European thought. And one of them was through so-called scientific racism. Yeah, so this is a archival piece of Petrus Kampert in city center of Amsterdam, Newmarket. You have a space just like this where he used to dissect people, and some of them were African people. And he developed a theory where he looked at the question whether African people or black people, or the N-words as they used to call them back then, were part of the human family or a separate race, as a lot of people used to say to legitimize slavery. And the strange thing about his work is that his conclusion was indeed there's not much of a difference between so-called white race, yellow race, or Asian people, black people, white people. However, he made this image by studying the bones and especially the skull. They call it phrenology, looking at the way the skull was formed, and made this image. So in the image you see an ape, a monkey, African person, and European people. And this image was misused by other so-called scientists to state that African people were the missing link between the monkeys and the more developed and civilized Europeans. So this is just one of many examples. And so it's a very violent history because this was used to legitimize slavery, colonialism, because these people were less developed, so we have to, civilize them. The Belgians did it in the Congo, the so-called civilizing mission, literally killing millions of people under the guise of civilization. So you want to tell the story, but you don't want to, or at least we don't want to reproduce these images. And in a very simple, through a simple act, by showing this image, but blocking, a part of it, we try to stimulate people to rethink these kinds of images. And the same we did with these things. We have a huge collection of racist objects or objects with racist images. You do want to show them to tell the story, but you also want to kind of disturb and denormalize just, exposing them to a public. So these were one of the things that we we're able to experiment with a document. But the same with how do we curate a collection instead of saying like, hey, Africa, Suriname, gender. Yeah, we made a block, a little collection of books saying, but what was it? Palestina?
No.
Solidarity with Palestine
Yeah.
or something like that.
So these were not normal categories, but basically political statements to encourage people to think about social change. So, for instance, I didn't put black feminism, but how to be a better black feminist or support trans people.
Indeed. And because of that, because we thought, we could use our freedom of speech, artistic freedom to rethink, things that we take for granted, categorization, imagery. And we also, got a little bit of criticism here and there, not as much as others, but we still stand behind what we did and are very proud and grateful that we were part of that project. And as they said, the new moon continues, so we still try to use some of those practices. I'll skip a few things because of time. So I'm gonna end with a few recent developments that we're working on now. And some of you may have heard last year, December, the Dutch state, quote unquote, apologized for its role in the history of slavery in the Netherlands. I say quote unquote because the way it went was not to the satisfaction of a lot of people in the community. But despite that, it was a historical step because 10 years ago, that was unthinkable. People didn't even want to mention slavery. They were like, oh, it's a long time ago, are you still whining about it? I believe recently there was some discussion as well in the Belgian context about the Congo. They decided not to apologize. So it's a big step, but at the same time, we're like, okay, if you acknowledge that you've been part of this crime against humanity, then what's the next step? How will you repair the damage that has been done? How can we heal? How can we work towards equality and a lot of the values that you say you stand for? So that's what our next project will be about. Reparations, basically. So, as I said, I can talk a lot. I hope you found it interesting. And I want to thank you for your attention. Tomorrow morning there will be another session and we'll look into some other parts of our work as well. And I think there's still some time for Q&A. So if there are any questions, now is the time.
I have one question concerning Tula from Curaçao. What happened to him?
Oh yeah, thanks. Maybe it'd be nice if you ask the question, maybe that you say your name and what you do, where you would be nice. Then I know who is in the building.
My name is Rodney. I'm from Antwerp. I don't study in this school or whatnot. Yeah, basically.
Nice. Well, nice to meet you, Rodney. Tula, heroic but tragic story. Tula was one of the leaders. There were several more, Karpata and others. And what you saw a lot in general in colonial histories, you still see it now actually, but especially then in slavery, when people rose up, obviously it was a threat to the colonial order, so they came back hard. Curaçao is a relatively small island. Now there are about 150,000 people. It's relatively dry, so not a lot of, bush in comparison to Suriname. It's 5 times as big as the Netherlands. We literally just came from there. Went to the maroon villages. So Suriname is north of Brazil. So it's in the Amazon rainforest. So what you saw was that on the islands, Curaçao, it was a bit harder to run away and flee the plantation because there was not much space to hide. So they fought a few weeks. But yeah, the Dutch asked for support. So after about 2 weeks, a few ships with more military, more soldiers came, and they were able to overpower the rebels. And what you then often saw was that the leaders of the resistance were used as an example for the others. So they was Tula and the others were first abused quite violently. For example, Vierendelen, they literally pull off your limbs. The head was cut off and put on a stick, and the body was burned. So that's how cruel they were, to make a statement to the others, like, if you resist, this is what will happen to you. Pure terror, to instill fear. Same happened in Suriname on several occasions, but in Suriname we saw that because it's such a big country, you have the rivers into the bush, and a lot of the Africans and indigenous people, were familiar with the environment in contrast to the Europeans, so they were able to run away, flee into the bush, and set up their own communities. So in Suriname we have about 6 different maroon communities and indigenous communities who still today have their own semi-autonomous structures and communities. Yeah, basically that.
I have 2 questions. First one is, what is there? Because you're talking about education, especially in the beginning. So is there, or the Black Archive is mostly for informing general audience, or are you also busy with
Activism?
activism? Exactly.
Yeah.
So first of all, so like, what's the big plan for, or the big plan, if there's a big plan for the Black Archive? And then secondly, I can imagine there are other instances around the world that are also busy with similar work. And I can imagine that cooperation in this sense can lead to certain breakthroughs.
Appropriation?
Cooperation.
Oh yeah, cooperation. Yeah.
So yeah, I was wondering in that sense where you are.
Cool. So on the first question, you didn't want a little cookie in between. If you are involved in activism, definitely. I would even dare to state that without the activism of the past years in the Netherlands, the Black Archives would not exist, or at least not exist in its current form. Why? The short version, tomorrow we'll go into it a bit more, but at the same year that the New Urban Collective started, 2011, you could say a new movement started of anti-racism. Why? You've heard about the anti-Black Pete, maybe, the blackface tradition, St. Nicholas, Zwarte Piet, the blackface thing. The whole movement arose. And in that same period, NUC arose. And throughout time we became part of that as well. So we became part of a group called Zwarte Piet, started organizing protests, we were faced with a lot of issues as well. This is my car 2019 that was demolished by a few extremists. And that really, on the one hand, was very violent, tragic, even traumatizing. There have been people who really became traumatized and burnt up, and things like that. The other side of the coin is that the violence made it so clear that it's a problem that had to be addressed, that people were not able to deny that it's an issue anymore, which they used to do, like, it's just a small thing, it's just an innocent children's holiday, why would you, be sensitive about it? But because a lot of white people became so angry and violent, it was impossible to deny that it's an issue. So in that context of this societal debate that arose, the Black Archives also arose and developed, and I think that in the debate what you often see is that people, going back to Trio, especially around these issues, it was often very, emotional. And emotion is fine. I think it's human. It's even necessary. But especially coming to these historical facts, there's a lot of denial. But because we have this archive, we were able to bring very concrete, physical, tastbare,
Evidence.
yeah, like real things that you cannot deny. Yeah? So these are children's books, for example. I brought a few, tomorrow we'll go into them. Children's books, I think the big N-word book, Kafia, Shosh and Shemi, showing that, it's not just something people made up, but these are things that have been so ingrained in Dutch culture. And you can see it that through, the archival material that we have, that it's a real thing. So I think that really helped to develop the work that we do. So it really became intertwined with the activism. We've been really part of the activist organizations as well. And yeah, our current exhibition, as I said, is really about that. The racial imagery, as I said. But tomorrow we'll go into that with the children's books. And we'll talk about how we make choices in curating violent images. So that's that. And yeah, in terms of international cooperation, definitely. Both in the field of activism, but also in the arts. I think the Lumbung document is a very nice example where we met a lot of collectives who do similar work, but then in a different context or just in a different way. So we could learn a lot from them. They could learn from us. Very concrete. There's a Black Cultural Archive in London where we learned a lot from. That was our inspiration actually. And there's one in Berlin that is in development now. In New York, you have the Schomburg Center, also started as a community archive. And recently, literally last month, we opened the exhibition in Suriname, which has always been a dream of us because, we're always talking about Suriname, but we live in the Netherlands and we opened the exhibition about emancipation and movement history in Suriname at the National Archives there, where we brought part of our archive and also took stuff from their archive and saw how, it really connected. So yeah, that really helps to amplify the work that we do.
Do the archives and the exhibitions put the emphasis on the history of Suriname or Curaçao, or more about the overall Black experience?
Very good question. What was your name?
I'm Saron.
Saba?
Saron.
Oh, Saron. Yeah, that's it. Good question. We get that sometimes, this question like, hey, yeah, call yourself the Black Archives, but you only talk about Suriname or a lot about Suriname, which is true. And on the one hand, I can explain it because, the collection, or important part of the collection comes from the Surinamese Association. We are Surinamese ourselves. However, we call ourselves the Black Archives because in the stories that are already told, you see that even in the history of the movements, they were never only focused on Suriname or Curaçao. They were often part of an international network of mainly, or with a focus on, Black emancipation, but sometimes even broader on anti-colonial, anti-imperial movements. But we focus on Black history. And yeah, we try to do at least one exhibition every year. We started with the one on the Haswouts, which was partly Suriname, but actually about the broader radical anti-colonial movements. Then we did have one about this Association of Surinamese people, because they were existing 100 years. Then we had one about Facing Blackness, which is about the history of visual imagery about Black people in general, with the focus on the Netherlands, but also part of international context. And currently we are working on one on reparations basically. And in the future, we want to develop one on the broader African diaspora in the Netherlands. And the challenge is that we often base our work on the archive, but since the archive is much focused on Suriname, to a lesser extent Dutch Caribbean, let alone other African or Black communities, we try to collect from those communities as well. Or we're also gonna do one on South Africa, relation between the Netherlands, South Africa, apartheid.
If I may add, is the reason why we also developed the Black Archives is because when you talk about race, and in this case about blackness, it's often we look at the US and the UK, and there is not much about the people of African descent or Black people who live in Europe. So it was also my need to also add to the Dutch perspective of it, and also form solidarity with other Black communities throughout Europe, because we are so invisible. Because often when people think about Europe, they think about that's really white, but we live here too. There are so many histories, and what you would see, especially also in Mitchell's presentation, is that a lot of this Black history, whether it is in the US, UK, or even in Germany or in the Netherlands or even in Belgium, that is so international. And I think that is something that we can learn from, because especially in the times that we have now, social media is very easy when it comes to have solidarity. And then think about how people already lived in the 1920s, and there was such a heavy international movement to mobilize people and to talk about oppression. And it's, I think, to add to that, it's also, the Black Art is also about finding solidarities with similar histories and similar communities who have similar system of oppression that we face. Because we're also very much, through this society and system, we are so, hoe zeg je dat? Sparse sometimes in network and resources. I think it's really good to come together and find ways so we can mobilize people and just go for social change. Yeah.
Can I add something to that?
Definitely.
Because I'm Eileen. My name is a Mapuche name. It's actually from a folk in South America between Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. And well, my dad is from Chile, but we have a long history that I'm not going to tell right now about how we moved around in South America. But I do feel sometimes like we have so many more resources to like communicate with each other easy, like in a second your message is in Chile or I don't know, in Congo or in Suriname. But yeah, before we had that, sometimes I feel like people were better organized and like they had a clearer vision, like, okay, we want to do this, this is what we need. It's like everybody's distracted or something, and sometimes I think it's sad because there's many people who think in the same direction, and it would be nice to unify that, so it's nice that y'all are looking for like a way to do that.
Definitely. If I can also add to that, also coming back to your question, I think what makes the Black Archives a little bit more unique is how we activate it, but also how we make something as history very present. Also bringing it back, it's always about human rights, and can this world respect people's human rights? And in that whole process of indeed archiving, activating the archive, building a movement, you indeed see that solidarity, something that I also learned a lot during Documenta, is solidarity is a skill, and how do we develop that skill to come together? So that's something that I definitely learned from, even if it was very artsy. What I can take into my activism, how do you bring solidarity among each other?
Yeah, definitely. And if I may add a bit to what you say, I definitely agree that, especially doing this archival work, we were surprised as well to see how connected people were before we had these tools that should make connection more easy. Yeah, so now we have Instagram, Facebook, email, all these things. A few things, and you're already connecting with people on the other side of the world. Back then, yeah, they could literally travel by boat, hide the papers under their clothes, what Otto and Hermie did. Write a letter, wait for weeks for it to arrive. So, but I think that the downside of all the technology is that it's so much that you're easily, yeah, literally distracted. I think we know there's a lot of research that shows that a lot of these social media platforms are not designed to, connect people in a constructive way, but to, gain your attention as much as possible to make as much profit from advertisement and things like that. And you really notice that. So one of the things, for example, what I found interesting was 2020, where you had these huge protests, at least in the Netherlands, the Black Lives Matter protests. We had been protesting for years, and I think the highest amount of people that we were able to attract were maybe 700. That was like, wow, 2019. So we co-organized this protest to show solidarity with people in the US after the George Floyd murder. And we thought, maybe 1,000 people come, that would be great. All of a sudden it's like 10, 15,000, not one day, but days after each other. And I think on the one hand, of course, the very tragic and violent images of the murder played a role, but I definitely also think that the fact that we were in the pandemic, and there was no distraction of Champions League football, UEFA League, shopping, work for some. There was not that much distraction, so people were able to come to themselves more, connect to others, and they were able to join and show their solidarity. And now we're so-called back to normal. You see again that kind of fades when everybody's distracted. So I think indeed the challenge is to utilize these technologies in a way that does connect people in a better way. And that's why I love Archive so much, because sometimes it does take time. It's better to not directly send a message and make a statement online. Maybe you should first read, write, think, talk, listen, take some time, and then build something. So that's what I think.
Just the last question from my end. Is the Black Archives funded by the state in any way?
Good question. We started as a voluntary organization, the student platform association in 2011, and 2016 we turned into a foundation. We got a little bit of funding from especially different funds for the art projects. We still did it besides our jobs and besides us being students. And I think quite recently, 2021, we have some structural funding from the Amsterdam Art Fund. So that's indirectly via the local government. So every 4 years you have a round, and then they make a 4-year art plan. You can apply for it, and sometimes you're selected, sometimes not. We were selected, but the good thing I think is that I feel that we didn't compromise. So we still do the same things that we did 5 years ago, 10 years ago. We still say what we feel, we do what we want to do. And I think not we, just us, but because of the movement, we've also been able to influence the way, at least in the Netherlands and Amsterdam, cultural institutes and even funds look at these issues. That they don't just look at it from a very Eurocentric point of view, but there's actual policies being developed where they say like, okay, we do have to look at these things from multiple perspectives.
Yeah, exactly that. So the funds that are working with us, we also, as you can see on the picture, mobilize the country to look into it and say, hey, this should be a dialogue, like you should invest in this. in a developed market of doing funds. So we help create that market and also, yeah, reverse it back to the movement and people in the archiving basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
That's nice.
And maybe, yeah, this is a good thing. I didn't mention it today, but yeah, not sure about here. You see it worldwide, but definitely in the Netherlands that and people often talk about diversity. We need to diversify. We need to diversify, meaning that existing, often very white and old institutions, just want to add a little bit of color, a little bit of flavor to the dish that they already have. However, what we say is that that's not enough to just have some superficial color to a problematic institution. You really critically need to reflect on the history of the institution, the structures, the management and everything. You need to decolonize it. Yeah, even though that has a lot of meanings as well. But it does mean to look at the structures of power within these institutions and how it includes and excludes certain things. And for us, looking for decolonial theory, one of the parts of decolonizing is delinking. So instead of trying to be part of an existing institution or knocking on the door of the Rijksmuseum and saying like, hey, we want to be included, we were like, let's just do our own thing. We don't need them. And now we see that because we show that it's possible with the relatively little funds and resources that we had, we were able to build an alternative archive. And now we see that other archives, recently the National Archive Amsterdam of Netherlands came to us like, hey, what can we do? The City Archive came to us. So yeah, we see that creates a bit more consciousness. And as I said, there have been quite some development, some initiatives. Amsterdam Slavery Guide. This is a Words Matter guide by the Tropen Museum.
Yeah. But also to create awareness that funds should invest in self-led groups and organizations, otherwise they will reproduce the colonial system again.
Yeah.
So there should be self-led organizations who should receive a huge part of the funds that the state is giving out. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
We can continue this.
Yeah.
On a drink at Cas Cafe. But thank you, Mitchell.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, that was really amazing and insightful.
Thank you.
And I think that would be a good material as well for us tomorrow, who's going to be joining the class at 10 a.m. Thanks a lot.
Oh, maybe one last thing. If you want to know more, check us out on Instagram and the website. And we were in Suriname and we set up a crowdfunding for a school, because there's a school called the Otto Haswell School. Even though most people even there never heard about Otto Haswell, it's a beautiful school in one of the you could say low income areas of the city. And we started the crowdfunding to help the youths there, because the building is quite not good, not in a good state. So it's on our Instagram. If you have anything to spare, maybe €1, €5, €10, feel free to add, and maybe I'll see you tomorrow.
And share.
And for sure.
And share.
And thank you, Jessica, as well.